an amendment to the Constitution. If 2/3 of both houses agree to it, it is then sent to the states. And the states, by a 3/4 vote, have to approve the ratification in order for it to go into effect. So let's say that we want okay, let's use abortion as an example. And let's take the right-leaning direction. They want to impose a constitutional amendment that bans abortion. First thing you need is to be able to get 2/3 of the House of Representatives to agree to that, and 2/3 of the Senate to agree to that. And if they both get the 2/3, then it is sent to the legislatures of the states, and 3/4 of them have to agree to the amendment. That's how it becomes an amendment. That's how every amendment except one has come into effect. The remaining part of this talks about what I call the mirror image, which is the states themselves can call a constitutional convention for an amendment. And if 3/4 of the states approve of a constitutional amendment and then send it to the two houses of Congress, and the two houses of Congress agree by a 2/3 vote in each, that also amends the Constitution. The only time that has ever happened was in the repeal of prohibition. So when we get to talking about that, we'll bring this up again. The repeal of prohibition should not be of particular interest, but it does have some real interesting historical artifacts to it. So let's move on to the next, which is the second to the last article in the Constitution. Article 6, the debts, all debts contracted and engagements entered to before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. So as soon as they adopted this, the country couldn't, the new federal government couldn't say, haha, all of those debts that the old Confederation government owes, good luck trying to collect that. This says that as soon as this is adopted, the new United States government will basically accept all of those debts and see that they get paid off. So, and we have stood by that completely since 1789. Next slide. This one is huge. This is known as the Supremacy Clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. So what you have here is a hierarchy that says the US Constitution is supreme law. There is no law higher in the United States. The next level of hierarchy would be a federal statute passed by the Congress and signed by the president, or of equal footing, a treaty that was with the advice and consent of the Senate has been approved. That is supreme law. If any state tries to enact a law or has an existing law that would in any way be in conflict with the federal law or the federal treaty, the US Constitution wins. So that means every federal judge is bound by that. But every state judge is also bound by that. So a good old boy Texas judge couldn't say, well, federal judges have to follow the U.S. Constitution, but here in Texas we're kind of independent. We're going to do what we want. The answer is no. Every judge in every state is bound by the Constitution. And I believe in every state, every judge has to take an oath to that effect. And now you're talking about going all the way down to, constable, in a precinct in a county. Um, those are judges, and they are bound to see that the federal law is supreme. So the first order of magnitude is the U.S. Constitution. Second order of magnitude is federal law or federal treaty. Third in the hierarchy would be a state constitution. If nothing in a state constitution conflicts with the U.S. Constitution or U.S. constitutional law, then that state can apply its own state constitutional law. But as soon as there's a conflict, the decision has to be made in favor of the U.S. Constitution. And it goes all the way down to cities and counties and ordinances of city councils. So an interesting sidelight here, and again, very local. I'm sure a lot of you remember when the city of Farmers Branch passed an ordinance saying that if you are not a citizen of the United States or legally residing in the city of Farmers Branch, you could not live or work in Farmers Branch. As soon as Farmers Branch City Council approved that, it was appealed to a federal district judge for Texas, and it was immediately stayed, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court. I think they went to the Supreme Court twice over this, and the Supreme Court made it very, very clear. You are trying to regulate immigration and naturalization, and as we saw in Article 1, Section 8, that is the exclusive authority of the federal government. And so any attempt by Farmers Branch to try and do that is automatically void. So that's the importance of the Supremacy Clause, and it's huge. Let's see, what do we got next? Okay, Article 6, oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. So all executive and all judicial officers, here it is, both members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. And they stick this next line in here, which I think is very telling. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So, if we have a Jewish president or a Muslim president, or a Unitarian president, or a president of no denomination at all, an atheist president, there shall never be a religious test as to their qualification for the office. Of course, it does raise the interesting argument when you take the oath. Oftentimes, and we'll see this when we get to the amendments. Oftentimes, a state will stick something in there that says, I affirm to support the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. Well, is that some sort of a religious test? And the short answer is no, if you don't say, so help me God, they can't prohibit you from assuming this office. So probably enough there. And let's get to the very last article of the US Constitution, and very short and sweet. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same. In other words, as soon as 9 of the, by the time that this was written, there were 15 states. So as soon as 9 of the 15 agreed, this Constitution goes into effect. It did go into effect on September 17th, 1789. That is Constitution Day. So I'm sure a lot of you are probably fans of the musical Hamilton and the whole story about the writing of the the arguments as to why the state of New York should ratify the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. Very, very famous and very, very important guidance for the Supreme Court if they ever really try and, if it's an issue as to what was meant by the language when it was written. They very often go back to that document and other documents. But the interesting thing was the purpose of the Federalist Papers was strictly to convince the state legislature of New York that they need to ratify. And they were one of the, they were waiting and arguing back and forth. And Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and third guy, whose name escapes me at the moment. So the three of them wrote those Federalist Papers.
Was it Monroe?
Yeah, a small guy by the name of Monroe. How could I forget him? So now here was the interesting thing. The discussion that was raised in the Federalist Papers got a lot of New Yorkers talking. But while they were arguing back and forth, should they ratify or not, the 9th state, which I think might have been New Hampshire, the 9th state ratified. And so New York and the other states immediately joined because they said, well, hell, we can't be left out of this new government. So as soon as the 9th state ratified, the rest of them fell in behind. So with that, we're essentially done with the body of the Constitution. So before we get into the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, there's some historical interest here. They had just finished writing this Constitution. And as soon as the paper was done and the ink was still wet, states demanded amendments to it. Why weren't these things put in the first place? Most of the first 10 amendments revolve around individual rights, the rights of persons. And when they wrote the Constitution, the argument was, well, the individual states protect the rights of their individual citizens. And why should the federal government, states will protect their citizens? Well, what had happened, I think the discussion about why they were switching over to this Constitution, there were a number of insurrections all around the country, mostly relating to economic crises that were the result of the end of the Revolutionary War. And several of the states, including surprisingly Massachusetts, was talking about, in order to put down these riots and insurrections, removing the rights of citizens um, within Massachusetts from being able to protest. And so the states, the uh, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention said, if we don't, uh, we don't want to sign this Constitution. And so they hit a gentleman's agreement, which amazingly, because it couldn't happen today. They had written the Constitution, and now there was this demand for immediate amendments. And a gentleman's agreement was made. Let's ratify the Constitution as it is, with a promise that we will send out a list of amendments for the states to ratify through the amendment process that we talked about. And they agreed to that. Can you imagine? They signed it on the promise that that these rights would be written up in a separate list of amendments and sent around. That they had trust in one another when a promise was made. So that was kind of nice. Anyway, so as soon as the document was ratified, they send around uh, what were actually 12 amendments. All 12 of them will become part of the United States Constitution. The the first 10 we're going to see here are known as the Bill of Rights. What would ultimately become the 11th Amendment is not considered part of the Bill of Rights because it got adopted a little later than the first 10. And the last of the 12 original ones took over 200 years before it was finally adopted. It's the last adopted amendment to the United States Constitution. It was written in 1791, I think. And it was approved in, I'll look up the exact date. It was approved, I think, 235 years after it was first sent around. So, what are we doing in time here? We got a little bit. Let's dive into the first of the amendments. So the First Amendment creates 5 rights. It creates the right to speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly. And let's just take a look at the first line. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that first clause, you have the establishment issue, the establishment clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and it shall make no law that prohibits the free exercise of a religion. There are a million things to talk about with regards to what is an establishment of religion, what is the free exercise of religion. The language is very, very firm. Congress shall make no law respecting any of these things, including an establishment of religion or free exercise thereof. Well, what if I had a religion that believes in human sacrifice to improve the agricultural output of our community? We need to throw a young virgin into the volcano to appease the gods so we have a good harvest. Can Congress make a law stopping that? And the short answer, what should be on its face, the short answer is no, Congress can't make any such law because the language says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Well, that's been outlawed. What about religious practices regarding polygamy, multiple marriages? Those things have been outlawed, even though they have been recognized by a variety of religions for centuries. How did they get around this language? Shall make no law respecting the establishment or the free exercise of religion, except you can't do human sacrifices, even though it was recognized as, for centuries. Um, how did they get around this language? Well, Supreme Court said that language stopping things like human sacrifice, that's not a law regarding religion. That's a law regarding health and the public health. That's why you can't have animal sacrifices, because it's a health issue. It's not regarding the practice of a religion. It's a law that has something to do with health that, just by coincidence also has something to do with religion. So right here in the very, very first amendment to the Constitution, you are going to see language that says Congress shall not do a lot of things, and it violates this over and over and over again. So establishment of religion, free exercise. Let's talk about the Establishment Clause of religion. Can you put a tax on religion? Can you say that they have to pay a property tax? Most states say you can't tax them. The federal government was considering putting a tax on religious institutions. And the question is, can you tax it? Congress wanted to stay away from this hot potato. No taxes are put on establishments of religion. What about certain quasi-religions? Is ISIS a religion? Does it get full constitutional protection, or is it something less privileged than a religion? So these are the kinds of issues that go on. An enemy combatant in a prison in Guantanamo Bay, can they practice their religious, their religious sorry, the
Rituals.
words are escaping us.
Rituals.
Yes, their rituals. Or what about if they have dietary standards? Do they have to provide those dietary standards and rituals to enemy combatants of foreign nations? Or in this case, they're not even foreign nations; they're just enemy combatants. So lots of interesting things in the establishment, and I think we fully covered free exercise clause with things like human sacrifice and polygamy and things like that. So we've covered religion. Let's move to the next one. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So you've created two things here: freedom to speak and freedom to write. Can Congress make any laws abridging the freedom of speech? Well, there are defamation laws. Isn't that speech? There are laws against hate speech. Isn't that prohibiting somebody's right? I know it sounds horrible, but what if somebody wants to make a hateful speech? Does the government have the right to stop them? And in some regards, they do. What happens if they give a speech that incites a riot? Can they stop that kind of speech? Where is the line in the sand? How far can a speaker go before he violates his right to free speech? This is why the First Amendment, the religious and the speech and the press issues. This is why the First Amendment is one of the most litigated parts of the Constitution. Every year, dozens, if not hundreds, of cases are presented to the Supreme Court for consideration regarding First Amendment issues here. So let's see, in the interest of time, we've covered speech, we've covered the press. The right of the people to peaceably assemble. My goodness, can you get more current than what's going on right now? Can you stop protesters from saying that Black Lives Matter and that they want police reform and it's nonviolent? Can a government come along and say, we're establishing a curfew? Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the beginning language here, it says Congress shall make no such laws. Well, could a state make such a law? Could a county or a city make such a law? And the short answer is, in the 14th Amendment, which we'll get to in like 2 lectures, the 14th Amendment says that all of these things that Congress cannot do, state government, city government, county government also cannot do. So you have the right of the people to peaceably assemble. As soon as it becomes non-peaceable, the government has the right to step in. Again, how do you determine where the line is? If we allowed this to go on one more second, it would become violent. So we're bringing out the tear gas, or we're sending the police officers in to break it up. So the last right here is the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Probably the least important of the 5 rights that are here, but still an important right. And the reason this was put in, you can petition the government if you don't like that the state of Texas, the governor and the attorney general are doing everything they can to prevent vote by mail during this COVID crisis. Can you petition the government for redress of these grievances? And short answer is yes, you can. And what this essentially means is you can do it without fear of retribution or retaliation. Just because you can fill out a petition and collect a lot of signatures, we know that doesn't mean that the government's going to knuckle under and just do what the petition requires or requests. But we do know that you cannot be punished for presenting such a petition to the government. They can't say, oh, you're a troublemaker. We're going to have the Internal Revenue Service on your tail, investigating everything you do. Every time you park your car, we're going to see that you get a parking ticket, things like that, harassment. Cannot do that as a response to a legitimate petition for redress of grievances.
Hey, Bob, you see we've got a question in chat that relates to this amendment. Says, you see it?
Because I will pull it up. I was about to say my voice is just about to give out.
Yeah.
So we'll finish off our time here with open discussion, and next time we'll pick up with the Second Amendment because there's a long story there. So let me pull up chat here and see what we've got.
I'll read it aloud. It says, I found out recently that certain state legislatures, including Texas, have passed laws outlawing Sharia law. I maintain that this is unconstitutional, though never tested in the courts. What about this?
I would tend to agree that this is an attempt by a state to try and prohibit the free exercise of religious beliefs. What little I know of Sharia law is well, I don't want to compare it to other religious so-called laws like, dietary laws and things like that. But Sharia law, my understanding is it is a guidance for its membership as to how families are supposed to interact with one another. Um, Passing a law that that outlaws Sharia law itself is probably unconstitutional unless you can find some other reason for outlawing it that is not religious. For instance, the concept of honor killings. Okay, we know that it's a religious artifact that um, certain religions feel that it's perfectly appropriate to kill a son or daughter who has dishonored the family, and that's a religious belief. But that also is a public health issue, and so you can outlaw honor killings. Nobody that commits an honor killing will successfully be able to say, well, that's my religious right, because they say that goes beyond religion,
Hey,
or
Bob,
it's not solely religion. Yes.
there's a response saying it's more than that. It forms the basis of crime punishments like cutting hand or thieves' eye for an eye, etc. Taken literally. It's taken literally.
Yeah, and again, it becomes a public health. I mean, the government will say you can practice your religious beliefs as long as it doesn't harm another person, but cutting off a hand or the eye for an eye sort of thing. Now it goes one step beyond religion, that it is not in the general welfare. And so we can say, even though there's an argument that, well, it's religious based, the argument can also be made it goes beyond religion, and we can stop it for that reason.
Okay, there's also a question about freedom of the press. And it says, is a reporter from a foreign press protected by freedom of the press?
They are protected from uh, when they're here in the United States, but we can't assert any power over their home country. So I guess we can look at the what was his name, Jamil Khashoggi, um, who was an American citizen. Um, he was a reporter for the Washington Post, and he was very, very critical of things going on in Saudi Arabia, which was his native country. And not even going to Saudi Arabia, he was visiting Turkey, and he was abducted at the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey, and murdered. Um, what can the United States do about that other than very loudly and vociferously complain and maybe put sanctions on? But our right to freedom of the press, our right of reporters' privileges, like the privilege to keep sources secret, these are things that our country has adopted. A lot of other more liberal democracies have adopted, but there are huge numbers of countries that do not agree with this. And, we can try and protect them when they're here, but when they go back to their own country, you've got some problems. There was another issue that's kind of similar. Let's see if I can recall some of the facts of it. We are holding the Iranian government wants the United States to turn over somebody that we have kind of granted asylum to. in the United States, and refuse to turn him over because it's clear they just want him to execute him. So we don't have to give in to the demands of those foreign countries when they are trying to express their more conservative, right wing, in our way of thinking, backward types of laws. But we can't stop them from retaliating with trade things and making deals with enemies of the United States to try and get leverage to get what they want. So and I like these questions that are coming up because clearly you are seeing how difficult this religious freedom and this free exercise of speech and press and things like the right of people to peaceably assemble. These things are ongoing for almost 300 years now, and it's still a repeating issue over and over again. And it's this First Amendment that protects it. That's one of the reasons why First Amendment is so often used in cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Do we have
No,
any
that's it.
other?
Well,
Okay,
nobody else. No
yeah,
one else. He's losing his voice. No one else has posted, so we're going to close it down for the night, ladies and gentlemen. And we'll see you next week. And I will be posting this and hopefully the recovered one from last week on YouTube. But once I do, I will send out an email. So you all have a good evening, and we will see you all next week.